The pandemic exposed the great inequities in our society, and certainly in education. Many of us know that in the spring, millions of kids in the United States and in many countries throughout the world could not participate in any learning at all because they don't have access to the internet in their homes, or because they don't have screens which to use for learning. Both problems are related to poverty and what we call the digital divide. On top of that, most schools were not prepared for what occurred, and so they did not provide real guidance to teachers on how to use the technology or how to deliver meaningful instruction to kids. So, particularly our most vulnerable kids, kids who are with learning disabilities, and children who are homeless in the United States, or children who are in circumstances that are overcrowded apartments and the like, really were at a huge disadvantage and experienced tremendous learning loss. Now the policymakers have realized that it's really impossible to restart the economy, if that's even possible, without reopening schools. Otherwise, it will be unsupervised. So there's been a pressure on school districts to open, but without guidance coming from the federal government or from the states. And that means each district on their own is trying to figure this out and how best to meet the needs of its students and of its staff, because as we know, older people are more vulnerable. And this has created a huge problem across the country, because without proper guidance, schools are left on their own to figure out how to make this work. Teachers have recently announced to teacher unions that they will go on strike if their members are forced to work under unsafe conditions. So we're headed for what could be a huge crisis in education. That there has not been the kind of funding required to open schools safely in many districts and in many states. And so the absence of leadership in Washington and at the state level, I think, has created this crisis. We know that several countries that have opened schools prematurely have seen a rise in cases, such as Israel. We also know there are countries that have done this well that we could learn from, such as New Zealand and Denmark and Canada. And so the real question, I think, facing the United States is, when will leadership emerge that can provide the guidance that schools need on how to manage instruction appropriately and safely, and how to reopen schools when it's appropriate, in a manner that does not place lives at risk. The leading high-tech firms were in Washington taking questions from Congress. And that was one of the questions that was posed, is their responsibility, since, as we know, they have accumulated huge profits during this pandemic, particularly Amazon, because of home delivery. And they have a responsibility here to assist. We hear now they're talking about that, but it may be too late for many families. So in the absence of support from the private sector, it will again fall on local school districts. Now, districts will have to be creative without the resources. In some parts of the country, such as California, learning outside might be a practical way to address this problem, as long as you can ensure that kids won't get burned up by the sun. We know that learning or gathering outdoors is a lower risk activity. In areas where the virus is below, the rate of infection is below 5%, it might be possible for children to return to school. So there are guidelines on how to do this safely. There's a surge, and we're seeing a surge in cases, for example, in many areas, and agricultural workers being impacted in particular, such as the Imperial Valley in Southern California, then we're going to have to rely on community organizations like nonprofits and churches to step up to support families to deliver education to children in concert with the school district. So I would say that districts will have to turn to their local communities, turn to their families to ensure access. It's not ideal by any means, but the alternative is to do nothing. And I think doing nothing would be irresponsible.
I have spent this past month actually reading public-facing school reopening plans, both for K-12 districts across the country, as well as for colleges and universities. One of the things that has become painfully obvious to me in both sectors, K-12 and higher ed, is that many of these plans are entirely raceless. I want to be fair to superintendents and to university presidents. They have a lot to think about and a lot to manage right now as they put forth these plans to bring back educators and students safely. But I am afraid that a raceless plan for reopening is going to yield um, racially disparate outcomes, as we've seen in other parts of the pandemic. Right, we have seen the pandemic, really play itself out along racial and ethnic lines, specifically having particularly devastating effects on communities of color. So I'm really afraid that these plans are only going to punctuate those inequities in the context of schooling. There are at least five things. Really, I have about 30 things, but in the interest of time, there are at least five things that I think educators, school leaders, policymakers, journalists, and others ought to be thinking about as we consider a return to schooling. The first is ensuring that we have trauma and grief support for students and employees who have experienced loss in their families. Again, we know that the health disparities in COVID 19 mortality has had a particularly devastating effect on communities of color. So that means that students and employees of color, teachers, staff members, school leaders who are people of color, are probably going to be more likely than are their white counterparts to have lost, a member of their family or a valued member of their community. So it is going to be important to ensure that we have the sufficient mental and emotional wellness resources to help those students and those educators cope. Second, as we know, every industry in the American workforce tends to be stratified racially, with people of color serving in the least compensated, least powerful, least protected roles, and the executive leadership roles being, overwhelmingly comprised and led by white Americans. That same thing obviously plays out in the context of the schooling workforce, right? If we think about who the essential workers are, custodial workers, groundskeepers, food service professionals, those are overwhelmingly employees of color. So as we began to reopen schools and these employees are coming, you know, every day, but yet students and teachers may be coming on a more staggered schedule, I'm afraid that we are disproportionately exposing those essential workers, many of whom are people of color, to risk of contracting the virus. So therefore, at very least, we have to ensure that we have proper PPE, contact tracing, testing, and cleaning supplies for those Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Pacific Islander and Asian American employees who disproportionately occupy those service roles, those essential worker roles. Third, the pandemic made very clear to us at the start that we have tremendous digital access inequities. And we've talked about that already a little bit in this webinar, that access to high quality, reliable internet and Wi-Fi, tends to be inequitable in, students from lower income families. And given the way that race and class commingle in America, it's going to be disproportionately students of color who don't have reliable internet and access to Wi-Fi. So we have to pay serious attention to, for schools that are going to be completely online or schools that are going to be operating in a hybrid fashion, that we go and correct those digital access inequities that we knew about in March when we first were catapulted to remote learning. Two more things. We've seen throughout the pandemic that Asian and Asian American persons have experienced particular violence as people have associated them with the coronavirus. It doesn't help when the President of the United States repeatedly refers to it as Kung flu and the Chinese virus, it further puts Asian Americans at risk. We have a center here at USC, it's the Safe Communities Institute, and they have been tracking violence against Asian Americans across the country since March. And it is absolutely horrifying. As I read these school improvement, or these school reopening plans rather, they don't mention anything about how are we going to protect Asian and Asian American students, faculty, and staff. If we don't pay attention to that, I'm afraid that we are going to be exposing those persons to violence as they return to schooling. And the last part of this is that as I've read all of these plans in K-12 and in higher ed, it is very clear to me that there's far too little consultation with communities of color, not just in the racelessness with which the plans are written, but the things that are being prioritized are not the things that I'm hearing from Latino communities, from Black communities, from Indigenous communities. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to racialize the input and invite people of color, families of color, communities of color, students of color, and teachers and school leaders of color. We have to provide them a seat at the table to give us feedback and advice on what our reopening strategy ought to be. Otherwise, whatever strategies ultimately are developed are going to leave out those people. And again, they're going to exacerbate racial disproportionality. So I think that there's a role for philanthropists here for sure to help narrow, the gap. Nonprofits can also step up in this way. They're, especially in cities, there's a rich or a vast tapestry of college access providers and youth serving organizations.
I think the amazing disparities, right, that have always been present, but that have really been sort of laid bare by the conditions of this pandemic, are so insidious for kids' well-being and families' well-being and for kids' learning, because of the fact that the very same brain systems that we use to make sense out of our lives, to decide how we feel about things, to sort of think about what's coming next, to make sense of the changes that we're witnessing, and to try to figure out what we think and what we believe. Those same brain systems are also the ones that kids are using to make sense of schoolwork and other kinds of ideas and skills that you learn in a more traditional academic setting. And so they're directly, you can sort of think of it as directly competing for neural resources. When kids feel anxious, when they don't understand what's happening, when they see the adults in their lives worried and stressed and struggling, they naturally, that becomes the most salient thing to them. That's the thing that they most are thinking about. It's the thing that has the most direct tie to how they are physically and mentally, emotionally feeling. And so that's what they're thinking about, because our feelings and our experiences are basically cognitive events in addition to emotional ones. They're the stories we're constructing for ourselves inside our heads about what this all means. And the fact that kids are also either online a lot or completely isolated, if they don't have access right now, is also a pair of problems. It's really kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, being online a lot really changes the way the brain interacts with other people, with information, even very, very basic physiological cues that teach our brains how to grow, that make us feel well with each other, and that make us sort of co-regulate one another and get our minds into the same space together, which is a basic fundamental premise for effective teaching and learning relationships. That is triggered by simple things that we take for granted, like eye contact, right? Like noticing the physiological state of the other person, how a person breathes next to you, that shows I'm focusing deeply on this now. I'm sort of holding my breath and reading your paper, and that signals to you that I care about what you've written and that this is interesting and it's worth spending attention on. Those kinds of subtle cues are the things that really organize our brain development and that set kids up to be in a position to really engage with complex patterns of thinking together as a group, the way that school happens when it's done well. And so for kids who are online, they're having to really make up for the loss of those subtle cues, not to mention the strain of things like reading from a phone or a screen is much more difficult, just from a perceptual standpoint. And for kids who are isolated, they don't have those problems, but then they have the problem of not being connected at all in conversations that help people to sort of build meaning together, to understand what's happening, to feel like you're part of a community, like you're a valued member of something outside yourself, and like the world is going on and happening, which is a really vitally important force in young people's development. And so we have a kind of Pandora's box here of issues with this online learning. And I do think that there are some very not easy to do, but some potentially straightforward ways that we can start to think about ameliorating this problem. And they very nicely dovetail with the issues that Professor Nogueira, Dean Nogueira, and Professor Harper have pulled up in their conversations. First, we have a huge cohort of college-ready recent high school graduates who are not able to attend college this fall. If there were ways that we could tap into those young people and help them to become tutors, teachers, helpers, community activists around education for the kids in their vicinities, or for those who can get online, for the kids who can be contacted that way, we may have much more person power to put to the task, and teachers could become kind of directors of that in some ways. There's also capacity within schools themselves where young people who are a little bit older, junior and senior high kids, right, have skills that they need reviews on. They need to feel purposeful. They need to feel not like I'm waiting here isolated for the world to reopen, give me something, right? But instead that they have agency to actually build their community during this terrible time period, that they can leverage this for good, and they can develop dispositions of mind that that are like habits for thinking about, how could I help somebody today, even a little bit? What could my skills be useful for? What problems do I see in my community that I might be able to have an insight into or some way to help with? From tiny little things within somebody's own family to things within just your immediate neighborhood or church or community group, to broader than that if you have the resources to go broader. Engaging our young people as a brigade of community tutors for each other would have the triple purpose of helping those young people develop dispositions of mind toward activism, towards against complacency, towards civic duty, right? On the one hand, which helps them feel better. It actually, turns back. When you give, it turns back on you. Even neurologically, it helps you to feel healthier and more well, like you have a purpose. And purpose is one of the things that is so being lost in the space of this social isolation of this pandemic. So it would help our young people develop purpose and feel better themselves. It would help to solve the shortage of people who are able to contribute to teaching and learning activities within communities, families, neighborhoods, and broader networks, depending on the level of resources and online access and things like that. And then third, it provides a much needed review for those young people. If some 10th grader in Algebra 1 is asked to please go back and help this group of second graders think about, the number line and fractions, that's a useful review for them. And we know that revisiting that information, one of the best ways to really come to thoroughly understand something is to teach it.
So I actually represent all of the school superintendents in America. And we have been working, as you know, and you can imagine, with superintendents from all around the country in models for opening schools safely. We began that process back towards the end of March and April when we realized that most schools in the country were going to close, and then what would be the guidelines for reopening. So we pushed the CDC hard at the beginning because they were reluctant to come out with the very specific guidelines that we needed. And I think that we have seen throughout this whole process that part of the CDC's problem is the administration finds that the guidelines that the CDC has developed are contrary to, I think, their primary objective, which is to reopen the economy at all costs. So we have to deal with that. And so consequently, in working with our superintendents, the focus point are the CDC guidelines, and that the reopening of schools is based on a situation being, from a health perspective, safe for students and for staff. And basically, there are three models in general that have been developed. The most popular one is what's referred to as the hybrid model, where in order to deal with the spacing issues in a school, basically you bring in a portion of the school population that can be safely spaced 6 feet apart within the building, while the other students remain at home on remote learning. And then there are schedules that have been developed for that process to shift so that all students have the opportunity to be physically in school a certain number of days of the week. The other model is basically total remote learning. And the last model is basically returning to school as when we left. All the youngsters come in, no social spacing, no face mask, no regard to guidelines. I have to tell you that at the beginning of this process, and we've been at it all along, at the beginning of this process, there were many states around the country that were, particularly around the Southern Belt, that had decided that they were basically just going to reopen schools normal, without social spacing, without face masks. Today, that has changed dramatically because of the continuing increase in the infection rate in the United States. So many of those states, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Arizona, Texas, are now looking at it very differently. And those school districts have reversed themselves and are now saying that they will open remotely. We can pretty well expect at this point in time, unless there's a dramatic change in the infection rate, that most school districts will open remotely. And of course, we've heard about the problems that that has in terms of the needs of youngsters to be in the building. And we all want the children to be in the building. So there are a number of issues, I think, that can facilitate the ability of schools to at least open partially for some of the students, if not for all. All of those require money. And so one of the things that we are doing as an association is that we are very active in the Washington, D.C. area in terms of working with Congress to make sure that those dollars come forth. We have estimated, and our organization was the one that developed what the actual cost would be for school districts to be able to open safely in terms of what they would need for sanitizing the school, for protective equipment for teachers, in order to the busing, which would minimize significantly the number of kids that could be in a single bus, so more busing would be required. And our estimate comes up to about $490 per student, just for the safety issues. We've also heard about the number of children that still today, as we speak now, there are 11 million children out there that still do not have the laptops that they will need for remote learning and don't have the internet access in the home. So we are proposing a $200 billion package. And when I say we, not just the superintendents, every education organization in Washington, school boards, the teacher unions, every organization worked together in saying we need a $200 billion package in order to safely open schools and provide the students with what they need. What we're seeing from Congress are, at this point, 3 different packages. About a month ago, the House came up with their HEROES Act, and the HEROES Act was proposing a $58 billion expenditure for education. Remember, we're asking for $200 billion. The Senate Democrats just came out with their bill, and they're proposing $175 billion. And that's much closer and the best of the three packages. The Senate Republican bill proposes $70 billion. What we're asking also within those bills are dollars for what we refer to as E-rate. That's the program that's in place right now that provides homes with telephone access if they economically are able to receive that kind of funding. We want a similar situation for internet access so that every home in this country has internet access, and this bill would pay for that. We're asking about $4 billion to be able to do that. And that could be done very quickly and would be the fastest solution. I heard Pedro at the beginning talk about getting the communication companies to chip in. We've been at them at the very beginning of this process. They're not willing to do that. So that's going to be the problem. The solution here is to get the federal government to put up the money to do it. So all of these things together are basically necessary for schools to reopen safely. So at this stage of the game, we could almost predict that the way things are going, the majority of school districts in America will be doing remote learning from the beginning of the school year till this situation changes dramatically. Because in order to bring any children into the school, dollars will be required. In California, you've seen that our 6 largest school districts the superintendent have already indicated that they can't open school. They did that over a month ago, that they cannot open school because they don't have the funding to do it. So they're going to open remotely. So we're seeing more and more of that happen. And it's critical that we push our representatives in Washington to be sure, both Republicans and Democrats, to be sure that the money is coming. Now, here's the problem. Today's the last day in July. The Senate is going on their summer break. When is this going to happen? If it doesn't happen till probably, realistically, if it happens at all, it would be towards the end of August. There are many school districts that are already planning that they would open at the beginning of the month, around August 17th. And other school districts, primarily in the northeast section of the United States, who talk about opening after Labor Day. Well, they're not going to have the time to plan what they're going to do. That's why they're saying they're going to begin with remote learning, because who knows when and if Congress will finally act, and those monies will be available, and those monies will be coming to the district.
So the answer to our overarching question, can distance learning be done with equity for all kids, is a simple yet challenging one. My first response is no. It cannot be done with equity. Still, there is a lot to unpack, and it starts with considering the inequities in California. It starts by delving deep into rural, underserved, and unserved communities like those that I represent in the Central Valley of California. We need to understand what they lack before we can even get to what they need, to be at par with surrounding communities, counties, and regions. For example, in the communities I represent, East Arosi still hasn't had clean drinking water for the past 10 years and must rely on bottled water deliveries to bathe, cook, and clean. And sadly, they still pay for water they can't even use. Students in this 200 plus home community only know that water comes from a bottle and not from their own tap. A true testament of inequity, and yet the issue of broadband access is just one of many in which the residents are without. When this pandemic started, Gedham and Seville were left in the dust from the onset. While many of the school districts that surrounded them transitioned to online education, Gedham and Seville had to hand out packets of schoolwork because of poor broadband infrastructure and limited internet capabilities and devices to distribute. In places like West Goshen and Delft Colony, These spaces do not even have a community center where students and families can engage with and build up. With no internet infrastructure whatsoever, communities like these are hidden deep between the silos of wealth to the north and wealth to the south. Sadly, we haven't even addressed our students with learning differences and the challenges that will transpire due to that inequity. You see, I believe we reached a pivotal moment in real time where we need to re-envision what school looks like for the future. We need to muster up the courage to dream big, work hard, and believe in better for the next generation of students in education. We can no longer look back or stay stagnant, something that I think that we all are doing in education. For example, there are two bills in the state legislature that I'm closely looking at that can have a massive impact on underserved and unserved communities with respect to distance learning and broadband access. Though we may not see it in the immediate, if passed, these bills would get us closer to the equity in access to technology, not only for schools, but for communities as a whole. And that is AB 570, which is Aguilar Curry's bill, and SB 1130, which is Gonzalez's bill. And these are game changers for education. In SB 1130, this bill would require the commission to develop, implement, and administer the California Advanced Services Fund program to encourage deployment of 21st century ready communications. And the Gonzalez bill would provide that goal no later than 2024, which again is ways away, but still. Approve funding for infrastructure projects that will provide high capacity, future-proof infrastructure based on current engineering and scientific information at the time of program application. And this bill would require the commission in approving infrastructure projects to approve in providing these high capacities, especially to underserved areas. And then under Aguilar Curry's bill, it would on an annual basis require the State Department of Education in consultation with county offices of education to inventory the needs of local educational agencies for computing devices and internet bandwidth with priority given to schools serving pupils in low-income neighborhoods. The bill would require the State Department of Education to post a report on the inventory on its internet website. So these are just two of many others that we need to tackle at the state level.
Yes.
I think that holding districts accountable is reasonable, but may not be fair because the districts may not have the resources. The federal government waited a long time to begin to think about how to ensure that the monies that were coming out were going to the schools. And now they're putting pressure on, but they haven't, for example, in Los Angeles, we have schools. See, I have kids at home too, and so it's hard. We have schools that, have 35, 40 kids in a class. No resources at all going into how do you do social distancing in this kind of situation. So I would say, yes, the districts have a responsibility to play here, but without the support of the state and the federal government, it is setting districts up to be blamed. In the chat room, I put two, what I think are two silver linings that I think I'd encourage reporters to keep in mind. One is, some people think this means the end of public education as we know it. I think the opposite is true. I think people will see that without public schools, the situation is unbearable. There are many parents, including many affluent parents, who wish schools were open right now because they're struggling with their children. And secondly, we now see how important parents are. And we have to continue to emphasize the role of parents in education. We cannot, in the same ways we can't just wait for government to save us, we can't rely on the schools alone. Parents have to play an active role in supporting their children. Jeff Bezos has made almost $1 trillion. He's raking in incredible profits. His business, so is Facebook, is dependent on people having internet. They have a moral responsibility, and if they don't act morally, they should be held accountable by the Congress to invest in access to the internet. It is a basic right at this point in our history.
around the second week of June, there were so many companies really across industries, but especially in tech, who were making these headline grabbing announcements about billions of dollars or millions of dollars that they were investing into Black led organizations, anti racism efforts, and so on, following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. The truth is, many of those tech companies made those announcements about the money that they were putting up without fully even knowing how they were going to spend every one of those dollars. So, over the past several weeks, many companies have been reaching out to us at the USC Race and Equity Center asking for advice on things that they can invest in as a part of those, multi-million dollar and billion-dollar investments that they announced. So I think that that is a lever that could be easily pulled, where we don't have to actually embarrass a tech company or press them. Like, just say to them, Amazon, you made this announcement back in June that you were going to be making this humongous investment. Here's how you could direct some of those resources that will help address some of the racial equity issues pertaining to schooling. And particularly schools that primarily enroll mostly Black and brown students.